Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Holly Harris, Executive Director of the U.S. Justice Action Network. Holly, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Holly, you point out that America represents 5% of the world's population, but fully 25% of the world's prisoners. What's going on here? Are Americans especially wicked?
Well, we've got too many people in prison for flimsy reasons, as John Boehner recently said, and we're spending too much money to keep them there. Currently, we have 2 million Americans behind bars,
Wow.
and we're spending $80 billion a year on incarceration and associated costs. And to put that into proper perspective, with that amount of money, we could send 12 million students to college and pay their fees. So are we especially wicked? No, we're not. But we've been especially stupid with respect to the laws that are on the books and the time period in which we're sending individuals to prison. And so our goal with the U.S. Justice Action Network is to safely reduce the prison population and associated costs, to address the over-criminalization of America, which means we're interested in getting a lot of these ridiculous, unfair, and duplicative laws off the books. And we're hoping to break down barriers for ex-offenders to ensure that we can remove government obstacles to them getting good jobs, being able to support their families, and live crime-free lives.
I'd like to get into each of those subjects, but before we start, let's look back a little bit. If you look at the historical graphs, the number of incarcerated Americans seem to have taken off like a rocket in about 1980. What caused the sudden acceleration?
Well, and you're exactly right. The federal prison population over the last couple of decades has gone up more than 800%. And I'd like to take you back to when Bill Clinton was then Governor Clinton. He was running for the White House for the first time. He took to the steps of the Houston City Hall to rail against then President George H.W. Bush's record on crime. Clinton was surrounded by uniformed police officers, and he proclaimed, "I want to be tough on crime." That November, Governor Clinton was elected president, and 2 years later, he signed what has been called one of the most sweeping federal crime laws, which expanded the federal prison system and required harsh punishment. Sounded great at the time. It was the politically correct thing to do at the time. 20 years later, he's now apologizing to America. He now has said that the law that he signed actually did not make us safer, but led to an epidemic of incarceration around the country. And it's actually the states who have led the way and have provided the gold standard that the federal government is now trying to follow with respect to reform. And I'd like to point out specifically Texas, North Carolina, and Georgia. In 2006, Texas was faced with a problem. They had to spend $2 billion on 17,000 new prison beds, or they had to completely overhaul their justice system. So instead, they overhauled their justice system, and they drastically reduced the prison population. And now Texas has the lowest crime rate since 1968.
But let's get back to that. I want to probe the past a little bit because this does look like a bipartisan problem. Let's remember the war on drugs was kicked into high gear by Richard Nixon. 1980 were the Reagan years when this whole thing took off. So there seems to be plenty of blame to go around. What are the trends that started way back then, even before Bill Clinton put his hat in the ring, that caused both parties to get locked into this treadmill?
You're right. It did start before Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was the individual actually who signed the law that got us into a lot of these problems. But the rhetoric started long before that. As you mentioned, we all grew up on the rhetoric of just say no to drugs and the war on drugs. And unfortunately, we had a knee-jerk reaction to this epidemic. And instead of sitting back and really being thoughtful, a lot of politicians, again, seized on this and implemented policies that we now know were failures. And the reason we know they're failures is because crime rates went up, the prison population went up, recidivism rates went up, and that's certainly not making our communities safer, which of course should be the goal. And again, I'll point to the states, Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, Ohio. These are states that have either reduced or flatlined their prison populations while also reducing crime rates. And so, now, of course, we see what's happening on Capitol Hill. Republicans and Democrats are working together toward an overhaul of our criminal justice system. And now they have data from these states that have implemented these reforms and been very successful and made their states safer.
If you take dysfunctional cities like Detroit and Baltimore off the table and you look at national crime statistics, they've pretty much dropped across the board for the last 25 years. Proponents argue that this is precisely because so many lawbreakers are in jail that they can't commit more crimes. Do they have a point?
No, they really don't. And again, the data, which, we pull data from very well-respected organizations like Right on Crime, the Pew Charitable Trust, and the data shows that where you see the best drop in crime rates is in states where they have implemented these forms, where they, again, have safely reduced the prison population. We're not talking about just a free-for-all, let everybody out of prison. We absolutely believe, our organization believes, there are certain individuals who need to be in prison, who pose a danger to society. But for those nonviolent, low-level offenders, prison might not be the best place. And one thing that we always forget is that the vast majority of the individuals that we put in prison are coming out someday. And so the question is, who are we returning to society? Are we returning to society an individual who's even more dangerous than he or she was when they went in? Or are we returning a person to society who's been rehabilitated, who's had treatment, who's had counseling, and who is now prepared to enter the workforce, support his or her families, pay taxes, and live crime-free lives?
Hi, that's an age-old debate among prison reformers. We seem to be in a new era now, particularly with so much data being collected. After prisoners do their time, they often have an extreme difficulty assimilating back into society, leading to high rates of recidivism. What is the Ban the Box movement, and how might this help?
Ban the Box is a policy that both Republicans and Democrats have supported that would remove the box from a government job application that requires a person to disclose that he or she has a criminal record. Because very often when you do that, you're then eliminated from the process. And so here's some statistics that I think would be very interesting for your listeners. An individual who's been incarcerated works 9 weeks less per year and takes home 40% less annual pay than his or her colleagues. This has real economic impact. And so, our goal is to remove that government obstacle, whether it's the box that requires that person to disclose that he or she has a criminal record, or if it's the criminal record in general. Our organization is very supportive of clean slate proposals that would allow low-level nonviolent offenders after a certain crime-free period to have their records sealed. There would be automatic sealing of their criminal records where law enforcement could still have access to their records for safety purposes, but private employers could no longer access that criminal record. And so that person then again has that obstacle has been removed, where that person then can move forward, get a good job, pay taxes, support his family, and live a crime-free life.
How would you handle jobs in which public safety is involved, or, for example, a bus driver who has a record of alcohol-related crimes, or working with children?
Now, remember that, with respect to the Ban the Box policy, that's not to say that an employer can't do a background check, especially if this is of crucial importance
to the
for
job.
That specific job, whether it's to be a corrections officer, a police officer. So, the employer can still do a background check. It's just that preliminary hurdle, which is, do you have a criminal record? Are you a convicted felon? That preliminary hurdle is removed. So that person then perhaps can move to the next level, which would be a job interview, where the individual can sort of explain the circumstances surrounding that arrest or that conviction, and then could also talk about how that person has been able to get treatment or counseling, or how he or she has changed his or her life.
It could have been a teenager who was led astray and then turned his life around and now is starting over as an adult.
Exactly. I'll tell you a compelling story out of Pennsylvania. A young woman got in touch with our organization and told us that she had had trouble with drugs, spent time incarcerated, but she had since cleaned up her life and had gone to college, got a 4.0 GPA, had recommendation from a judge and from her professors, but she couldn't get a job because of her criminal record. And that is exactly the person that our organization seeks to help.
Holly, if you look at the statistics, African Americans both commit a disproportionate number of crimes and are disproportionately the victims of crimes. Michelle Alexander wrote a book a few years ago called The New Jim Crow. her thesis was that mass incarceration was a plot to keep African Americans down by cycling them through the criminal justice system so they could legally be denied the right to vote, among other things. What do you make of her perspective?
Well, I'll say that our organization, and that's, again, we'll go back to the policies that we support. Overcriminalization is an issue where we take a look at a criminal code, or where policymakers can take a look at a criminal code and say, okay, are some of these crimes, do they have a disparate impact on low-income communities and communities of color? And, certainly Rand Paul has been out in front talking about how these harsh penalties for low-level drug offenders do have a disparate impact, certainly on the African-American community. And that has led to bloated prison populations and certainly to high taxpayer bill that we have to pay for our prison system. So I think in that respect, certainly there is some merit to the notion that our criminal justice system isn't fair to communities of color. But I think that, again, can be addressed with smarter sentencing laws and through efforts to end the overcriminalization of America.
Criminal justice reform must be one of the few political issues in the country where President Obama and the Koch brothers are both pushing in the same direction. Not to mention a growing roster of strange bedfellows from the right and the left. Who's pushing back the other way?
There is a small group of U.S. attorneys and former U.S. attorneys who've gotten very little press, who have pushed back and said even very archaic things like we should spend more money on prisons, which is almost shocking to hear. Almost nobody believes that that is an effective way to move our criminal justice system forward.
It's one of those usual remedies for government failure. This policy's not working. Let's do more of it.
Sure. But, what I would say is the data just doesn't support their position at all. And I think that's why now we're seeing presidential candidates, almost all of them now, have weighed in and said that they are in some way in favor of reform. And they've all come at it from a different perspective. Carly Fiorina recently talked about, her very personal connection to reform because an individual in her family had struggled with drugs for so many years. Certainly Rand Paul has had the most robust platform on criminal justice reform and has criticized, how many low-level drug offenders that we have incarcerated. Mike Huckabee recently took to a podium in San Diego at the ALEC conference and bemoaned the high price of our prison population and talked about how many students we could send to college instead of spending $80 billion a year to keep people incarcerated. John Kasich actually has had a very unusual platform. He's talked about the way that the mentally ill are treated in our prison system, and he's even called it a disgrace that we incarcerate the mentally ill. So regardless of perspective, all the candidates now have come out and talked about how they're in favor of reform. They've just talked about different aspects of reform.
Well, just rounding out the field, when Donald Trump is done building his wall across Mexico, what's his position on justice reform?
I haven't heard Donald Trump say much about justice reform. Certainly immigration has been his hot topic. But, look, we hope that Mr. Trump favors justice reform. We hope all of these candidates favor justice reform. I do want to mention Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Martin O'Malley have all said that they are in favor of justice reform. Martin O'Malley has a very specific plan, addressing smarter sentencing. So on the right and the left, we are now seeing these candidates come out and talk about justice reform. Our hope is that they will all propose very specific initiatives to address our problems in the criminal justice system and that they will talk about it more.
A bipartisan bill on criminal justice reform is expected to come out in September. Any expectations on what it might cover?
Well, there's already some proposals that are on the table at the federal level. There's the Smarter Sentencing Act that addresses sentencing reform and getting rid of certain mandatory minimums. There's the Corrections Act that deals in back-end reforms, allows prison inmates to earn credits and get out of prison earlier. There is the Safe Justice Act, the Sensenbrenner-Scott bill, that probably sets the bar the highest. It has front-end reform, sentencing reform, back-end reform, and then also addresses the issue of overcriminalization. What you mentioned, Senator Grassley, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, is expected to drop a piece of legislation in September. We don't know quite yet what's going to be in that legislation, but it's our understanding there should be some combination of front-end and back-end reforms. We're now hearing that Chairman Goodlatte on the House side, the House Judiciary Chair, may have a proposal of his own. So I expect and anticipate that there will be a number of reform proposals on the table. The key is to be able to find consensus and get enough Republicans and Democrats to the table to agree on these terms to push a comprehensive criminal justice reform bill across the finish line that we know the president's going to sign.
Take us back to the state level. You mentioned earlier in the show that Texas had made some exemplary reforms. Are there other states that are doing well or others that are doing particularly poorly?
Absolutely. Well, I do want to mention the states where the U.S. Justice Action Network is spending considerable resources this year, and that's Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. In Ohio, there is a task force, actually, that it's called the Recodification Committee that is tasked with overhauling the state's criminal code. The Senate president there is very supportive of that effort. We're in constant communication with them, and we'll be very involved in that process to try to get a lot of these unnecessary, unreasonable, and duplicative laws off the books. There's also a ban the box proposal that's moving through the legislature that we're very supportive of that would codify Governor Kasich's executive order that banned the box for his administration. In Pennsylvania, there's a real problem in Pennsylvania on reentry issues. Currently in Pennsylvania, for an individual to have his or her record expunged, you have to reach the age of 70 and been crime-free for 10 years.
70.
Or you have to have been dead for 3.
Oh, that's
which
helpful.
Is outrageous. Everybody would agree that's not an opportunity or a second chance for an ex-offender. That's an impossibility. So we are working on a piece of expungement legislation that would allow an individual with a criminal record who had been convicted of a low-level nonviolent crime after a certain crime-free period to petition the court for expungement of his or her record. In Michigan, we're working on sentencing reform, and the governor there in Michigan, Rick Snyder, has been very outspoken about his support for criminal justice reform. There will be a number of legislative vehicles that he'll be supporting there and will, of course, be helping get those proposals across the finish line. One of them is presumptive parole. Currently in Michigan, offenders serve 127% of their minimum sentence, and there is a bill, House Bill 4138, that would mandate that offenders serve 100% of their minimum sentence, and then the burden shifts to the parole board to show a compelling reason why that offender should not then be paroled. And the hope, of course, is that it will, drastically reduce the prison population in Michigan. So we're very active in a lot of states, and states are all very different. There's no one-size-fits-all proposal. But certainly with the success we've seen in Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, to a certain degree in Ohio, we're very hopeful that, these reforms will pass in our target states and will pass overwhelmingly with bipartisan support.
Where does public opinion stand? From Ferguson to Baltimore, we've seen some pretty spectacular displays of public disorder in the past year. Do TV images of out-of-control mobs setting fires and looting stores lend urgency to the need for reform or make the argument that more of these people need to be locked up?
Oh, I think there's an urgency for the need for reform. The question now is, and I think what the public is asking is, do these laws make us safer? And that's really the lens through which we determine, the U.S. Justice Action Network, how we determine what policies we're going to support. And so I think the public now is seeing that extremely harsh penalties for low-level nonviolent crime, that isn't helpful. It's just not helpful.
Right.
All it does is just
manufacture criminals.
All that does is increase the price tag to the taxpayers, and that's taking away from a lot of policy areas like healthcare and education and economic development that could potentially keep these individuals from committing crime in the first place. So, what we actually think that the public appetite for reform is very high right now, and it's across the board in every community.
Mm-hmm. Well, President Obama has recently taken a very visible role calling for criminal justice reform. He spent much of the last 6 years militarizing local police forces. Has that trend crested, or are we going to see more armored vehicles and high-tech weaponry on our streets?
I'm not sure. And, it's really unclear. I think the data is unclear as to whether, this will be effective in, criminal justice or effective tool for criminal justice. And, our organization hasn't really dealt we haven't delved into that very much.
Sure.
But it is interesting, and I do think it's interesting that, now, very late in his term, that President Obama is just now speaking out on criminal justice reform. Certainly, we welcome that voice, but it sort of underscores that the states have been very involved in criminal justice reform for years now, and only now is the federal government catching up. And the reason why is because the states bear the brunt of the financial burden. Of the $80 billion spent per year on jails and prisons, 50% of that is shouldered by the states. And that's why the states are acting, and they've acted, sooner than the federal government. And so our hope is that these states that have set the gold standard, that have the data to prove that these policies work, that the federal government looks to those states to implement their own reforms.
Well, Holly, it sounds like you're making some great progress and have a long way to go. We'll definitely keep following this issue. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Holly Harris, Executive Director of the U.S. Justice Action Network, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. If you'd like to help us expand, please stop by realclearradio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. That wraps up our show for this week. We'd like to give a special shout-out to our new listeners in Spokane, Washington on KSBN 1230 AM, taking us up to an even dozen stations in our growing radio syndicate. Please join us for Real Clear Radio Hour next week, same time, same station. See you then.